On the 11th of January 1993, a 14-year-old boy named Benji Stanley was waiting for food at a takeaway in Moss Side. He had no part in any feud and no enemies of his own. Gunfire came through the window anyway, and he lost his life. No one was ever brought to court for it. His death became the symbol of a city that newspapers had started calling Gunchester. That was more than 30 years ago. Everything about Manchester's underworld has changed since then. The street corners traded for encrypted phones, the local gangs replaced by networks reaching across continents. And yet one thing never changed at all. Across 4 decades and 10 of the most notorious networks this city ever produced, the same dark engine kept turning, powerful people using disposable ones. What follows traces that whole arc, from the gang wars of the 90s to the bosses undone by their own secret messages, drawing only on verified court cases and real names. This is Manchester's most notorious drug networks. Section 1. The Gucclo Gang and the Birth of Gunchester. To understand how one English city earned a frightening nickname, you have to start somewhere very small. Gucclo was a short, quiet cul-de-sac of semi-detached houses on the Alexandra Park estate in Moss Side, South Manchester. It had an alley running off one end, a few front gardens, and nothing about it that looked dangerous. Yet this ordinary little street gave its name to one of the most feared groups in British criminal history. The name outlived the street itself. In the mid-1990s, when the Alexandra Park estate was redeveloped, the road was redesigned and quietly renamed Westerling Way, as if the council hoped that erasing the address might help erase the reputation. It did not work. By then, the word Gooch had detached itself from the bricks and mortar and become something far bigger and far harder to demolish. The story began in the early 1980s. Moss Side at that time was a community dealing with high unemployment and real hardship, and it was, and remains, a centre of Manchester's Black British and Afro-Caribbean community. Some young men in the area, finding it hard to earn money in the normal way, started gathering around an unlicensed drinking spot, a she-bin, on Gucclo and selling illegal substances. There was no grand plan and no single person handing out orders. It was a handful of local lads, a street corner, and a way to make cash. Over time, that loose group hardened into something with a name, a reputation, and a sense of ownership over its patch. People started calling them the Gooch. What turned a street corner operation into a decades-long problem was rivalry, and the way that rivalry began is revealing. The Gooch were not the only group in South Manchester. Across the same estate and in the streets nearby sat the Pepper Hill mob, named after a pub on the east side of Alexandra Park. The trouble did not start over product or corners, it started over an alliance. The Gooch had close ties to the Cheetum Hill gang in the north of the city, buying and selling with them, and one of the leading Gooch figures was a cousin of the head of Cheetum Hill. The Pepper Hill side saw this as helping the enemy, and they declared that nobody from South Manchester was to do business with Cheetum Hill at all. That demand enraged the Gooch, and a fierce war erupted, splitting the Alexandra Park estate cleanly in half, the Gooch holding the west side and the Pepper Hill the east. As the substance trade grew more profitable through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the disagreements grew uglier, and weapons started appearing on streets that had never seen them before. The police were not blind to this. In August 1991, Greater Manchester Police launched an undercover operation known as Operation China, aimed directly at the substance networks in Moss Side. It worked, at least for a while. 23 leading figures were arrested, and over the following months they were sent to prison on substance and weapon charges, with sentences across the operation reportedly totaling more than 100 years. For a short period, the streets went quieter. There was even, briefly, the flicker of something that looked like peace. Pressured by the arrests, some older figures on both sides began contemplating a ceasefire, and by late 1992, rival Gooch and Doddington men were reportedly even meeting to play football together amid talk of a truce. But removing the older leaders did not remove the problem. Younger members simply stepped into the gaps left behind, and many of them were more reckless than the people they replaced. The Pepper Hill side, hit hard by the raids, regrouped around nearby Doddington Close and renamed itself the Doddington Gang, and the feud carried on with fresh faces. The fragile talk of truce evaporated. By 1992, the conflict had become so well known across the country that newspapers started using a grim nickname for the city. They called it Gunchester. Then came the moment that horrified the entire nation. On the 11th of January 1993, a 14-year-old boy named Benji Stanley was waiting for food at a takeaway in Moss Side. He had nothing to do with any group and no part in any feud. He was simply a teenager getting something to eat. An attacker fired a weapon through the shop window, and Benji lost his life. No one was ever brought to court for what happened to him. His death became a symbol of how far things had fallen, and a reminder that the people most often hurt in these feuds were not the ones causing them. The details of his killing make it harder, not easier, to understand, and that is part of why it haunted the city for so long. Benji was a tall boy, well over 6 feet, and the prevailing belief was that he had been shot in a case of mistaken identity, gunned down for someone he was not. For years, one theory held that the real target was the friend standing beside him, since Benji had been wearing his friend's jacket and riding his friend's bicycle that day. That line of inquiry eventually came to nothing. Many years later, in 2011, the authorities indicated they believed the intended target had actually been a Pepperhill-linked man who closely resembled Benji and who had himself been shot and wounded near the Pepperhill pub in 1991. The grief rippled outward. Hundreds of people marched through Moss Side, demanding an end to the violence, and Benji's death became a rallying cry. Yet, for all the outrage, the central fact never changed. A 14-year-old was dead, and no one was ever held to account. The sheer brazenness of the era is hard to overstate. In September 1993, the leader of one of Britain's main political parties, Paddy Ashdown, visited Moss Side to see the troubled area for himself. During his walk through a rundown shopping precinct, he was reportedly confronted by a suspected teenage Gooch member openly brandishing a submachine gun. A national political figure, on a public visit, faced down by a child with a serious weapon in broad daylight. That single image captured how completely the extraordinary had become ordinary. For years afterwards, the conflict ground on, and 2 names rose above the rest within the Gooch. One was Colin Joyce, known on the streets as Piggy. The other was Lee Amos, known as Cabo. Joyce had actually grown up on territory linked to a rival crew, but after being told to pick a side, he joined the young Gooch alongside his childhood friend Amos. The young Gooch was an offshoot identified around 1996 that gained a frightening reputation for the violence and the weapons its members used, and Joyce and Amos became the most talked about figures in the area, their names appearing again and again whenever serious trouble flared. Joyce, by some accounts, styled himself as the gang's general, a self-image that captured both his ambition and his arrogance. The numbers attached to that period are sobering. By 1999, incidents associated with the Gooch were said to account for a remarkable share of all the recorded gun crime in the whole of Greater Manchester, a single gang from a single estate casting a shadow across an entire region. Between January 1997 and November 2000 alone, the area saw hundreds of shootings, and only a tiny fraction ever resulted in a conviction. By the mid-2000s, the Gooch had grown into something much larger and looser than a single street gang. It had become a network of smaller offshoot crews spread across South Manchester, factions with their own names and their own leaders that were connected to the Gooch, but often acted on their own. This sprawling structure made the gang harder to define and harder to break, because there was no longer a single head to cut off. It was less an organisation than an ecosystem of violence, feeding the same long war with the Doddington and the Longsight crews year after year. Their luck ran out, briefly, around the turn of the new century. Acting on an anonymous tip that someone was being held against their will, armed officers raided a house on Ruskin Close in Moss Side. They found no captive. What they found instead were several members of the Gooch, including Joyce and Amos, along with a hidden collection of weapons, described by those who saw it as an extraordinary array of firearms. In 2001, Joyce was sent to prison for 9 years, and Amos was locked up as well. For a time, it looked like the worst might be over. It was not. Both men were released on license in 2007, meaning they were let out early under supervision. Almost immediately, a fresh wave of armed conflict broke out in South Manchester. The cycle that had defined the area for 20 years started turning again, and the people of Moss Side braced for more of the same. The violence of this period reached a depth that shocked even those used to the feud, and 2 killings in the summer of 2007 sat at its heart. In June, a 24-year-old man named Gucclo Chin was shot dead in a daylight ambush. Just weeks later, in July, a young man named Tyrone Gilbert, who was connected to Chin, was killed during the funeral proceedings for Chin himself, shot in a brazen attack as people gathered to mourn. Targeting people as they grieved at a funeral marked a new low, an act of cruelty that treated even mourning as a battlefield. These were the 2 deaths that would eventually anchor the case against the gang's leaders. This time, though, the police built a case that would not fall apart. The investigation that finally brought the Gucclo leadership down was painstaking and patient, built over a long period through covert work, the analysis of around 80,000 phone records, and, most remarkably of all, the testimony of 6 protected witnesses. That last part was extraordinary, because in this world, talking to the police was seen as the worst thing a person could do, and those willing to do it had to be shielded for their own safety. Persuading 6 people from inside that world to give evidence against their own was the breakthrough that everything else rested on. In April 2009, after a trial lasting around 6 months, Joyce and Amos were found guilty of the most serious offences, including responsibility for the deaths of Gucclo Chin and Tyrone Gilbert. The trial had deliberately been held in Liverpool, about 35 miles away, to lower the risk of witnesses being frightened into silence. Joyce, who was 29, was given a life sentence and told he would serve at least 39 years. Amos was told he would serve at least 35. 3 other members of the gang received minimum sentences of between 30 and 35 years. In total, 11 members of the Gucclo were convicted. The city's chief prosecutor, John Holt, described the result as having enormous significance for public safety. The effect was real and measurable. After the convictions, armed incidents in South Manchester dropped sharply, with police reporting at one point that gang-related shootings had fallen by more than 80% compared with the previous year. The constant feuding that had run for 2 decades finally lost its engine. A specialist police task force devoted to gang and gun crime in the area, set up in the mid-2000s, was widely credited with helping to drive shootings down, working street patrols and targeting the main offenders. The force also adopted a policy of treating young people on the edge of gang life as children at risk, rather than simply as criminals, even delivering warning notes to the homes of those it feared were being drawn in. The senior officer leading the force spoke of the need to keep weapons off the streets and to reach young people before the gangs did. But the change ran deeper than policing alone. Employment in the area, which had been desperately low in the 1990s, began to rise, and investment slowly returned. Even the physical landmarks of the era were transformed. The Pepper Hill pub, once a flashpoint of so much violence, was eventually shut down and became an Islamic community centre. Moss Side, a place whose name had become shorthand for danger, slowly began to be known for something other than fear. That said, the cost of those years was never far from the surface, and the area's residents understood better than anyone how fragile peace could be. A decade after Benji Stanley, in September 2006, a 15-year-old boy named Jesse James was shot dead while cycling home from a party. Like Benji, he was believed by police to have had no involvement in gangs. And like Benji, his killers were never identified because no witnesses would come forward. The 2 deaths, separated by 13 years, bookended an era and made the same unbearable point. The youngest and most innocent were the ones who paid. Even after the major convictions, there were grim reminders that the danger had not vanished overnight, including the shooting of a 16-year-old outside a pub in 2009, a boy police had previously tried to warn away from gang associations. The 2 men at the centre of it all met very different ends. Colin Joyce remained in prison serving his long sentence. Lee Amos died behind bars at HMP Oakwood in April 2024, at the age of 48, his death marking a quiet full stop on a chapter that had once seemed like it would never close. What makes the Gucclo story matter is not the weapons or the prison terms. It is how something so small became so destructive. A short street, a few young men with no work and no money, and a way to make fast cash grew, year by year, into a conflict that took real lives and frightened an entire city. Nobody designed it. It built itself, one decision at a time, and once it had momentum, it took 20 years and an enormous police effort to stop. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the Gooch did not rise in a vacuum. While they fought for control of the south of the city, another group was building its own fearsome reputation a few miles north, in a district called Cheetum Hill. To see the full picture of those years, we have to cross town and meet the people the Gooch sometimes did business with and sometimes went to war against. Section 2. The Cheetum Hill Gang and the War for the City. While the Gooch were fighting for control of the south of Manchester, a different group had taken root in the north, in a district called Cheetum Hill. They called themselves the Cheetum Hill Gang, though most people in the city knew them by another name, the Hillbillies. Many of them grew up on a handful of housing estates in the area, places like the Waterloo Estate, the Halliwell Estate, and Haywood Street. That tight geography mattered, because so many of them came from such a small patch. They trusted each other in a way that some larger groups never managed, and that loyalty became one of their biggest strengths. Coming from such a small, close-knit part of the town is often pointed to as one of the main reasons the gang held together so well against rivals, who were frequently weakened by their own internal disputes. The gang had a strong sense of its own identity, almost a culture of its own. Members could often be identified by their tattoos, many bearing the letters CHG somewhere on their upper body, a permanent mark of belonging. Younger recruits had to earn their place, known as the Young Cheetum Hill Gang, or the Little Hill Gang, until they were considered old enough or had proven themselves enough to drop the word young or little from the title. This was not a loose collection of dealers. It was a structured organization with ranks, initiation, and identifying marks, more like a fraternity of crime than a casual street crew. And that structure is part of what gave it such staying power. The gang had become established by the early 1980s, after clashes with crews from Moss Side and Salford. The roots of that long rivalry with Moss Side are revealing in how small and human they were. By one well-known account, the whole feud traces back to a christening party on the Alexandra Park estate, where a prominent Cheetum Hill robber, known as the Gladiator, had his drink knocked and an apology refused, and seized the moment to beat a Moss Side man badly and make a statement. The story goes that the dispute also tangled up a grievance over a woman who had left the Gladiator for a Moss Side figure. No shots were fired that day, but the lines were drawn, and from that ordinary party grew years of bloodshed. It is a reminder that some of the most destructive feuds begin not with grand criminal ambition, but with wounded pride. At first, their reputation was built on robbery. They were known for fast, frightening raids on cash targets, the kind of jobs that took planning and nerve. As the years went on, those raids grew bolder and more lucrative. An early heist on an Asda supermarket reportedly netted around £75,000 at gunpoint. By the end of the 1980s, the targets were bigger and the violence worse. In April 1989, the gang carried out an armed takeover of a cash depot in Royton, Oldham, an attack in which security guards were shot, and one gang member was later jailed for 20 years over that violent robbery. Just months later, in June 1989, gang members opened fire on the doormen of a nightclub called the Thunderdome, a direct assault on the people who controlled access to the city's nightlife. The robberies became something of a speciality passed down through the gang's ranks. Two brothers associated with the Hillbillies, the Adetoro brothers, were said to have carried out at least 14 robberies over a 2-year span in the mid-1990s, terrorizing shoppers and staff with shotguns. The criminal careers of that family ended dramatically in April 2000 with a shootout with police on the M6 motorway, after which one of the brothers received 8 life sentences to run one after the other. But as the years went on, the gang moved into something far more profitable than robbery. They began selling illegal substances, and they did it in a way that was loud, public, and impossible to ignore. Their favorite hunting ground was the city centre nightlife. Members of the gang would push their way into bars and clubs and sell substances openly on the floor, sometimes standing at the bar drinking champagne without ever paying for it. Doormen and club owners were terrified of them. To say no was to invite trouble, and the trouble could be severe. The list of venues where their violence spilled over reads like a roll call of the era's nightlife. Clubs such as the Isobar, Piccadilly 21s, the Gallery, and Club Havana all saw their doormen attacked across the 1990s. The violence was not limited to fists. At one drum and bass rave, a rival from Moss Side was stabbed in the head, and outside another club, two gangsters from Rusholme were stabbed in the neck. These were not bar brawls. They were a gang using terror to take control of who sold what and where. The most famous casualty of this campaign was the Hacienda, the legendary nightclub that helped define Manchester's music scene. For a while, the club had been kept relatively safe by a respected head doorman who understood how to keep the city's gangs at bay. When he left and was replaced by a security firm brought in from London, the fragile peace collapsed almost overnight. Within a fortnight, gang members were threatening the new doorman at gunpoint. The club's famous co-founder, worn down by the relentless intimidation, eventually felt he had no choice but to close the Hacienda's doors entirely. With police help, it later reopened, but the gang simply went back to attacking the staff and the clubbers. It was one of the clearest examples of how a single gang could hold an entire city's nightlife hostage. This brings us to the figure who sits at the very center of the Cheetum Hill story, a man whose short life and violent death captured everything about that era. His name was Anthony Johnson, though almost everyone called him White Tony. The nickname was a plain reference to the fact that he was a white member of a gang whose membership was mostly black. He was born in July 1968 into a family marked by deep sadness. His mother was only 15 when she had him, and he was raised largely by his step-grandmother, a woman named Winnie Johnson. That name carries its own weight in British history. Winnie was the mother of Keith Bennett, a 12-year-old boy who went missing in 1964 and was one of the victims of the Moors killings, a case that haunted the country for decades. Tony grew up in the shadow of that family tragedy. He left school at 16 and was pulled into the gang world quickly. He started near the bottom, doing robberies, and worked his way up until he became a driver and bodyguard for the gang's leadership. He had a fearsome reputation. In January 1988, he was involved in the death of a rival from Moss Side, a man named Anthony Gardner, who was shot outside an unlicensed drinking spot. The detail that tells you everything about that world is what happened next. People inside the building heard the shots, assumed the police had arrived, and rushed out, throwing their stashes into the street. Officers later found more than £1,000 worth of substances abandoned on the pavement like rubbish. Johnson's violence reached well beyond Manchester. On one occasion, he and other gang members were at the West Indian Carnival in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, when a scuffle escalated into a shootout, with several people hit, many of them not connected to any gang. Johnson was arrested over the incident, and while two of his companions were jailed, he was released. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. He was at the center of serious violence again and again, yet the most serious charges never seemed to stick. Johnson rose to become one of the most powerful figures in the Cheetum Hill gang, and he was not shy about it. In 1990, police spotted him wearing a protective vest and carrying serious weaponry, a discovery that genuinely alarmed officers, since they had not realized quite how heavily armed the city's gangs had become. He helped push his gang into a direct war with the Moss Side crews after a rival group lost a large shipment to police, leaving them weak and exposed. Johnson moved fast to take advantage, and the fighting between North and South Manchester escalated. But power in that world was dangerous to hold, and Johnson made enemies even among people who might have been allies. He fell into a bitter dispute with members of another well-known Manchester crime family, the Nunans, over how the money from a large robbery should be split. That robbery, a security van raid carried out at Mumps Bridge in Oldham in November 1990, had brought in a huge sum, more than £360,000. A month later, Johnson struck again, robbing a sweet factory in Sheffield with two other masked gunmen and getting away with around £78,000. Arguments over money like that did not stay arguments for long. By a New Year party in early 1991, a gun-carrying Johnson was openly threatening men connected to the Nunan family on a club door. The fuse was lit. In February 1991, the dispute reached its terrible conclusion. Johnson, then just 22 years old, was ambushed in the car park of a pub called the Penny Black on Winterford Road in Cheetum Hill. He was with a friend known as Black Tony McKee. The ambush was carefully laid. As Johnson drove in, the pair's escape was blocked by a taxi, and a man sitting inside it, who used a wheelchair, opened fire and hit McKee, who began running for a nearby house. The attack then widened, and Johnson was hit as he tried to get away. According to accounts of the killing, a voice called out to finish him off, and further shots followed. He did not survive. The pub itself was shut down and burned shortly afterwards. It later emerged that the building was part owned by a member of the Nunan family. What followed showed just how hard it was to bring anyone to justice in this world. Desmond Nunan, a senior figure in that crime family, was put on trial for the killing. The first trial, in 1992, fell apart. A second trial, in 1993, ended with him cleared of any wrongdoing. No one was ever convicted for Johnson's death. The pattern was becoming familiar across Manchester. Witnesses were too frightened to speak, evidence was thin, and the people at the top kept slipping through the net. In the years that followed, figures linked to the case faced repeated accusations connected to frightening witnesses and tampering with juries, the very tactics that kept key people from ever testifying. Johnson's funeral was an event in itself. More than 200 people attended. A motorcade of around 30 cars made its way to the southern cemetery in the Chorlton area of the city, and so many mourners turned up that the service spilled out of the chapel and into the graveyard itself. For all his violence, he had been a figure of real standing in his world, and his death sent a shockwave through it. The gang did not fade away with him. If anything, the Cheetum Hill gang reached its peak in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when many considered it the most powerful crime group in the entire city, one of the most feared organizations in the whole of the United Kingdom. Certain streets in the area became, in effect, no-go zones where even neighborhood wardens and police trod carefully. The gang took over empty council flats and used them to sell substances, including units inside a 14-story tower block on the edge of the district, near the border with Salford. And while turf wars made the headlines, the quieter business never stopped. Many of the gang's members were eventually jailed for their role in selling heroin and other substances, the steady trade that funded everything else. As late as 2015, a Manchester court convicted a group of Cheetum Hill operatives over a substantial heroin importation and distribution conspiracy worth around £2 million, with the product smuggled in from Turkey using a string of couriers and combined sentences running past 50 years. The names and the faces changed across the decades, but the trade endured. The gang's long and bloody history has since been documented in books and television, including journalist Peter Walsh's detailed account of the Manchester Gang Wars, which described the conflict between the city's crews as one of the most prolonged in British history. The gang's structure was also more sophisticated than outsiders realised. Rather than operating as one solid block, it split into smaller splinter cells whose members still answered to Cheetum Hill, a flexible arrangement that made the whole organisation harder to map and harder to dismantle. It is one of the reasons the gang proved so durable while the gangs to the south tore themselves apart. What stands out about Cheetum Hill is the contrast with the Gooch. Where the southern gangs were often weakened by their own internal feuds, the hillbillies held together, drawn from a small area and bound by loyalty. That unity made them harder to break, and it is part of why they stayed at the top of Manchester's criminal world for so long. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Yet behind the killing of White Tony Johnson sat a name that keeps appearing in these stories, a family whose reach stretched across the whole city, and whose grip on Manchester's nightlife was about to become the next great chapter in this history. To understand how organised crime really worked in those years, we need to look closely at the Nunans. Section 3. The Nunan family and the grip on Manchester's nightlife. The name Nunan keeps surfacing in the story of Manchester crime, and there is a reason for that. For roughly 2 decades, this one family sat at the centre of the city's underworld, not by selling on street corners like the Gooch, but by controlling something far more valuable, the doors. If you wanted to run a nightclub in Manchester, or sell anything inside one, you very often had to go through the Nunans first. The family came from an Irish background and grew up in poverty in the Whalley Range area of Manchester. It was a large family, with many siblings, And the brothers who became infamous were Desmond, known to everyone as Desi, his younger brother Dominic, and another brother, Damien. One small detail captures how the family saw itself. The brothers all had names beginning with the letter D, said to be their father's tribute to Dublin, the city of his birth, a pattern repeated right across the 14 siblings. Each of the infamous brothers grew into a distinct role within the family business. Damien sat near the top and ran the operation. Dominic was the charismatic, dangerous entrepreneur, and Desmond was the muscle, the enforcer, the man you sent when a problem needed to be made to disappear. Desmond's career began in the early 1980s, working as a doorman. In that world, reputation was everything, and his reputation as a fighter gave him standing fast. He was a huge man, physically imposing, and a former Greater Manchester police officer who dealt with the family, later described them plainly, saying the Nunans were synonymous with violence, that they displayed very little fear, and that they had no fear of the authorities, of prison, or of using violence. But Desmond was not content to simply guard a door. He started placing his own men on the doors of clubs across the city. Once your people controlled the entrance, you controlled who came in, what was sold inside, and who got a cut of the money. It was a slow, clever takeover, and it worked. By the late 1980s, it was said that the Nunan family controlled around 80% of all nightclub security in Manchester. That is an astonishing figure for one family to hold over an entire city's nightlife. The timing was perfect. This was the era of Manchester, when the city's music scene exploded and its clubs were packed every weekend. The white gangs of Salford largely controlled the booming trade in ecstasy and amphetamine, while the black gangs of Moss Side and Cheetum Hill dominated the heroin business, and at the centre of it all sat the clubs, where all of that product changed hands. The Nunans positioned themselves at exactly that choke point. Their golden goose was the Hacienda itself, the most famous club in the city, where Damien became head doorman. By running the doors and taking a cut of the substance profits flowing through the venue, the family was, according to one documentary, capable of making as much as £50,000 in a single night. That is the kind of money that explains why control of the doors was worth killing for. Around this same time, Dominic Nunan, the brother who would later become the most talked about of all, was jailed for 15 years for his part in an armed robbery at a bank in Cheetum Hill. That long sentence might have crippled a lesser operation, but the family simply carried on without him. While he sat in prison, his brothers Damien and Derek kept building, forging links with other major Manchester crews, including the very Cheetum Hill gang we met in the last section, as well as the gangs of Salford. The robberies that had built the family's early fortune never entirely stopped either. By the end of the 1990s, the Nunans were said to have made over £8 million from bank robberies and security work combined. This is where the threads of the story tie together. When White Tony Johnson was killed in that pub car park in 1991, it created a gap at the top of the city's criminal world, and the Nunans were perfectly placed to fill it. Control of much of Manchester's organised crime fell to Desmond and his brothers. Desmond himself was charged with Johnson's killing, but after a first trial collapsed and a second ended in his favour, he walked free. No conviction ever stuck. Over the years that followed, he faced charges connected to frightening witnesses and interfering with juries, the kind of pressure that left key people too scared to give evidence against him or his family. It was the same wall the police kept hitting all over Manchester, and the Nunans were experts at building it. The family's power did not rest only on the clubs. They ran protection rackets too, demanding regular payments from venue owners in exchange for being left alone, including from bars in the city's Canal Street area. These were sometimes darkly nicknamed pensions, regular fees extracted under the constant implied threat of what would happen if they were not paid. It was a business model as old as organised crime itself, and the family's fearsome reputation meant most people paid rather than test what refusal would bring. By the mid-1990s, Desmond was widely seen as an enforcer, a man other criminals turned to when they needed something dealt with, and his contacts stretched far beyond Manchester. He built relationships with serious figures across the country, including some of the most notorious names in the British underworld of the era, among them a major Liverpool drugs figure and the head of one of Newcastle's biggest crime families. Through those alliances, he moved weapons and substances between regions. One of those out-of-town alliances, based on running guns and product between the West Midlands and the North West, turned profitable and then turned sour, sparking a feud that left bodies in both Manchester and Birmingham. Desmond was questioned by police in connection with some of that violence, but, as so often, the case against him was dropped for lack of evidence. His record was not entirely spotless, however. In 1995, he was convicted of a violent attack on a pair of twin brothers, an assault during which the court reportedly described him as psychotic, and he was sentenced to nearly 3 years in prison. The family's reach grew so wide that by the end of the 1990s they were being described as one of the most notorious crime families in British history. Police believed, though never proved in court, that the brothers were connected to as many as 25 killings during their long reign. It is important to be clear about that number. It was a suspicion held by the authorities, not a fact established by any jury, and over the years it has been reported in wildly different and ever larger forms, which is exactly why it should be treated with caution rather than repeated as fact. Desmond himself seemed almost to play with the figure. In the documentary that would later make the family famous, he can be seen sipping a drink in a pub and telling the filmmaker that the police reckoned he was behind most of the murders in Manchester, before scoffing at the idea that he was down for 25 killings and dismissing it as nonsense. In the same breath, he boasted that he had a bigger army than the police and more guns than the police. Whether bravado or confession, it captured a man entirely comfortable with his own terrifying legend. The Nunans were never convicted of anything close to that murder count, and Desmond in particular was a man who seemed to slip free of the most serious charges again and again. There was also a side to Desmond that complicates the simple picture of a gangster, and it is one of the most genuinely unusual things about him. He was a committed Irish Republican and a lifelong anti-fascist, not just in sentiment, but in action. He was involved in the militant anti-far-right movements of the 1980s and 1990s, the kind of groups that physically confronted organisations like the National Front and the British National Party on the streets rather than merely protesting against them. In one well-documented incident in 1993, Desmond reportedly confronted a man who had recently set up a local branch of the British National Party at a pub in Whalley Range, telling him directly that being anti-fascist was something he believed in to his core, and effectively pressuring the far-right group out of the area. He saw himself as a protector of his community against people he despised, even as he built a criminal empire. People are rarely just one thing, and Desmond Nunan was a man of genuine contradictions. Desmond's reputation also made him, strangely, a peacemaker. The sheer power of the family meant that when the gang wars in Moss Side were at their bloodiest, Desmond was one of the figures with enough standing to broker a truce. He sat down alongside other major names of the era, including Paul Massie of Salford, his own brother Damien, and Jimmy "the Weed" Donnelly, a prominent figure in another famous Manchester outfit known as the Quality Street Gang, and for a short period, that truce actually brought a halt to the bloodshed. It is a reminder that in this world, the people powerful enough to stop the violence were often the same people responsible for it. His story ended in March 2005, and it ended in a way that shocked even those who knew the violence of his world. By that point, it was believed Desmond had developed a serious dependence on substances himself, his life consumed by alcohol and crack cocaine, a long way from the powerful enforcer of a decade earlier. On the night of the 18th of March, he had been drinking in a pub in the Wythenshawe area. In the early hours, his wife Sandra received a phone call. Her husband told her he had been stabbed and asked her to come and collect him. By the time she reached him, he was lying unconscious in a Chawton street. An ambulance was called, but he died of his wounds before reaching hospital. A local man, Derek McDuffus, was later charged and convicted of his killing and given a life sentence. He had to be kept in solitary confinement in prison to protect him from the Nunan family's revenge. The timing was extraordinary. Desmond died just days before a television documentary by the journalist Donal McIntyre was due to be broadcast, a film whose first installment was titled The Trials of Mr. Latley Fotfoy, in which the family, and especially Dominic, had openly displayed their power and their reputation for the cameras. It was later released and became widely known as A Very British Gangster. That documentary would go on to make the Nunan name nationally famous, turning a local crime family into figures of grim public fascination. His funeral, held that April, was a spectacle. Hundreds of mourners attended. A kilted pipe band played as his coffin arrived in a horse-drawn hearse at a church in South Manchester. For a man who had spent his life in the shadows, his send-off was anything but quiet. With Desmond gone, and with another brother, Damien, having already died in a motorbike accident while on holiday in the Dominican Republic in 2003, the family's grip began to loosen. Leadership passed to Dominic, who had been released from prison in 2002. Dominic was a strange and striking figure, and he became the public face of the family through the McIntyre documentary. He even changed his surname by deed poll to an unusual invented name, Latle Fotfoy, which was not a name at all, but an acronym for a brutal personal motto, roughly meaning, look after those that look after you, and do the opposite to those who cross you. It captured his entire philosophy in a single invented word. The criminal life followed him relentlessly. Within months of his brother's death in 2005, Dominic was stopped by police while driving his Jaguar and found to have a revolver and ammunition, including .357 Magnum rounds, hidden in the vehicle. A jury at Teesside Crown Court took little more than an hour to convict him of firearms offences, and he was jailed for 9.5 years, with the judge telling him plainly that he was, by occupation, a professional criminal. He accumulated more than 40 convictions over his lifetime, for offences ranging from armed robbery to assaulting police to prison escape, and by his own account, he had spent more of his life behind bars than free. But his later years brought a far darker reckoning. In 2016 and again in 2018, he was convicted of extremely serious offences against children, crimes that stripped away any lingering romance around the family name and revealed something genuinely monstrous beneath it. He was released from prison on licence in late 2025, an event that drew real public concern given the gravity of what he had done, and he remains subject to strict monitoring for the rest of his life. The Nunans show a different model of organised crime than the street gangs of Moss Side. Theirs was a business built on control, fear, and the quiet power that comes from owning the doors rather than the corners. But Manchester's underworld was never only about gangs and families. A few miles away, in the tough Dockland streets of Salford, a different kind of figure was rising, a man who would become known across the city simply as Mr. Big, and whose life and death would mark the violent meeting point between the old world and a frightening new one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Nunans show a different model of organised crime than the street gangs of Moss Side. Theirs was a business built on control, fear, and the quiet power that comes from owning the doors rather than the corners. But Manchester's underworld was never only about gangs and families. A few miles away, in the tough Dockland streets of Salford, a different kind of figure was rising, a man who would become known across the city simply as Mr. Big, and whose life and death would mark the violent meeting point between the old world and a frightening new one. Section 4. Paul Massie and the Salford War. Cross the River Irwell from the centre of Manchester, and you reach Salford, a tough Dockland city in its own right, sitting just across the water from Manchester United's Old Trafford Stadium. For more than 3 decades, one man's name was attached to almost everything that happened in Salford's underworld. He was Paul Massie, and the title that followed him everywhere was Mr. Big. Massie was born in January 1960, in Ordsall, one of the hardest parts of Salford, one of 6 children in his family, and his troubles with the law started early. He was just 12 when he was first arrested for criminal damage and sent away to an approved school, the kind of institution used for young offenders at the time. From those beginnings, he grew into a figure of real local power, and the way he built that power tells you a lot about how crime worked in the region. The nickname Mr. Big was not something Massie gave himself. It came from a Salford city councillor named Joe Burrows during a town hall meeting in 1992 held to discuss civil disturbances in the city. The local authorities claimed Massie held huge sway over what happened on Salford's streets. He disputed the claim, but he also seemed to enjoy the fame it brought him. and the name stuck for the rest of his life. It is a small but telling detail that the title which defined him was handed to him not by the underworld, but by a local politician, in public, almost by accident. Like the Nunans before him, much of Massie's influence came through the doors. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, the famous Manchester music era, the city's clubs and the rave scene were booming, and whoever controlled security at those venues held real power. In the 1990s, Massie set up several security companies, and through those firms he and his associates, working alongside figures including Damien Nunan, controlled the doors of a number of clubs across the Manchester area. According to police, those security businesses also gave a respectable cover for less legal activities, from moving money to the substance trade. It is worth noticing how the same handful of names keep reappearing across these stories. The Salford doormen, the Nunan family, the Cheetum Hill gang, the Moss Side crews. They were not separate worlds but a single interconnected underworld, doing business with each other one week and going to war the next. Explains why so much blood was spilled over what might look, from the outside, like the dull business of nightclub security. A doorman decides who comes in and who stays out. That means a doorman, or the firm he works for, also decides who is allowed to sell inside and who is quietly turned away at the entrance. In the booming club scene of that era, with thousands of young people pouring into venues every weekend and a roaring trade in party substances, the right to control a club's door was effectively the right to license the trade happening within its walls. Whoever held the doors held a tax on everything that moved through them. This is why the security business was never really just security. A firm could present a respectable face to the council and the licensing authorities with uniforms, paperwork and legitimate contracts, while operating as something closer to a tollgate on the city's nightlife. Massie understood this perfectly. By placing his people on the doors of multiple venues across the area, he built a network that generated steady, semi-legitimate income, while also giving him influence over who could operate in his territory and who could not. The wage from the door was the smaller part of it. The real value lay in the control. That control also explains the pattern of violence that ran through the whole era. When a rival firm tried to take over a door, it was not a simple business dispute. It was an attempt to seize a revenue stream and a piece of territory at the same time. Clubs became flashpoints, precisely because they were the places where the legitimate world and the criminal one met and overlapped, where an ordinary night out and a serious organized operation were separated by nothing more than which men were standing at the entrance. The same dynamic had already played out a few miles away with the Cheetum Hill gang and the Nunan family, and it would keep repeating across the city for years. Massie simply mastered the model in Salford, turning the humble role of the doorman into the foundation of a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. But Massie was a more complicated figure than a simple description of a criminal allows. Across Greater Manchester, he became known as a mediator, a man who could sit down with rival crews and broker peace between them. When the gang wars in Moss Side were at their worst, Massie was one of the figures involved in trying to negotiate truces, working alongside other well-known names of the era, including the Nunans. To some people in his community, he was a kind of protector, a local guardian who kept order. He even claimed to enforce a strict rule against allowing heroin into Salford, saying he used his influence to keep the hardest substances out of his community. Police often doubted how much real control he had over the trade, and treated that claim with skepticism, but it was part of the image he built. People in Salford respected him and feared him at the same time, and that mix is exactly what made him such a powerful figure. His criminal record was real, though. In 1999, Massie was sentenced to 14 years in prison for stabbing a man during a fight outside a nightclub. He served around 9 years of that sentence, much of it at Franklin Prison, before being released on license in 2007, and his return to Salford was treated as a major event in the city. He was unmistakably a man of standing, for better or worse. He even tried his hand at politics. In 2012, Massie stood as an independent candidate to become the elected mayor of Salford. He campaigned on community issues and youth engagement, pledging to really make a difference for the people of Salford. And although he did not win, he secured several thousand votes, finishing 7th out of 10 candidates. It was a remarkable thing for a man widely described as a crime boss to do, and it captured the strange dual life he led, 1 foot in the underworld and 1 foot reaching for respectability. He was at the same time a father of 5 and a grandfather many times over, a man with a large family and a genuine standing in his community, and a figure under active investigation by the regional organised crime squad. Both things were true at once. Massie's story ended in violence on the evening of the 26th of July 2015. He had just returned home and was outside his house on Manchester Road in the Clifton area of Salford, having parked his BMW and walked up the driveway, when a lone gunman, dressed in military-style fatigues, opened fire with a weapon described as similar to an Uzi submachine gun. Massie was hit by a hail of bullets and died at the scene. It was a Sunday evening, carried out in the open, and the sheer boldness of it shocked the entire country. Greater Manchester Police described the killing plainly as an execution and offered a £50,000 reward for information. What made the killing so dangerous was what lay behind it and what it threatened to unleash. By 2015, a bitter split had torn through a Salford crime group known as the A-Team. That group was headed by a man named Stephen Britton, and Massie was regarded as a kind of mentor to its members. His killers were tied to a breakaway faction that came to be known as the Anti-A-Team. The feud between the two sides had been building through 2014 and 2015, marked by extreme violence, and Massie's death was the most shocking moment in a war that the police would spend years trying to bring under control. The fear of all-out retaliation was well-founded. Authorities believed that one of the most horrifying incidents of the entire feud, the shooting of a young woman and her 7-year-old son at their home, was linked to retribution for Massie's killing. In the year 2015 alone, Salford saw 19 separate shootings. A single execution had threatened to set the whole city alight. The man responsible was Mark Fellows, a figure who earned the chilling nickname the Iceman. Fellows came originally from Salford but was living in Warrington. On paper, he looked like a minor criminal, with a handful of convictions for fairly low-level offences. In reality, he was something far more dangerous, a contract killer. Catching him was extremely difficult, because Salford operated under a deep code of silence. People settled disputes in the streets, not by talking to the police, and witnesses were often too frightened to come forward. For nearly 3 years, despite the large reward, the case went unsolved and the killing remained unclaimed. The break came only when Fellows killed again. In May 2018, a Liverpool criminal named John Kinsella, who had been a close friend and associate of Massie's, was shot dead near a road in the St Helens area. Kinsella was out walking his dogs with his pregnant partner, Wendy Owen, on an ordinary morning when a cyclist rode up behind him and shot him twice in the back, before turning the weapon on Owen as she ran at the gunman. She survived. The two killings, 3 years apart, shared such clear similarities that the police became convinced they were the work of the same hand. So the police built their case on science and technology rather than testimony, and this is where Massie's death became a turning point for British law enforcement. Investigating the Kinsella killing, detectives seized a Garmin fitness watch belonging to Fellows, the kind of device worn by keen runners and cyclists that records routes using a GPS signal. When they analysed the data stored on it, they found something extraordinary. A few months before Massie was killed, the wearer of that watch had travelled from Fellows' home to the exact spot behind a church where the killer had lain in wait for Massie. It was, in the prosecution's words, a reconnaissance run, a practice scouting of the murder scene, recorded and saved by the killer's own fitness tracker. It was a piece of evidence almost no one would have thought to leave behind, and it helped tie him to the crime without needing a single frightened witness to stand up in court. A painstaking review of CCTV across the area filled in the rest, placing Fellows and an associate near the scene. That associate was a man named Stephen Boyle, described in court as Fellows' brother-in-arms, who was accused of acting as a spotter, watching the victims and helping the gunman. In 2019, after a trial at Liverpool Crown Court lasting around 8 weeks and conducted under heavy armed guard, the jury delivered its verdicts after more than 30 hours of deliberation. Fellows was found guilty of both killings, those of Massie and Kinsella. Boyle was convicted of the Kinsella murder, but cleared over Massie. The judge handed Fellows a whole life sentence, meaning he will never be released from prison. At the time, that put him among only around 70 prisoners in the entire country serving such a term. The judge told him directly that he had never before had to deal with a contract killer of his kind. Fellows' violence did not end at the prison gates either. He was later seriously injured in an attack by another inmate, and years afterward faced still further charges connected to a death behind bars. Massie's funeral drew hundreds of mourners to the streets of Salford, with Manchester United flags draped along the route, a reflection of just how large he had loomed in the life of the city. To some he was a folk hero, to others a feared enforcer, and the truth sat somewhere uncomfortable in between. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Massie's killing marked the meeting point between two eras. His world was the old one of doors, turf, and face-to-face power. But the case that convicted his killer pointed to the future, a future where a person's own gadgets and digital trails could undo them. That shift was about to explode into the biggest series of takedowns Manchester's underworld had ever seen, when police found a way to read criminals' most private messages, and an entire generation of organised crime was caught completely off guard. Section 5. The EncroChat crack and the fall of Gregory Bell. For years, the people running serious crime in Manchester had a problem the older gangs never faced. Phones could be tapped, messages could be read, police could listen in. So the criminal world went looking for a way to talk to each other in complete secrecy, and for a while, they thought they had found the perfect answer. The journey to that answer was itself a kind of arms race. As police got better at intercepting ordinary calls and texts, criminals turned to ever more secure tools. For a time, modified BlackBerry phones running encryption software were the device of choice in the underworld. But as investigators learned to crack those too, a gap opened in the market, and into it stepped a service that promised something close to perfect secrecy. It was called EncroChat. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary mobile phone, but it had been stripped of normal features and loaded with special software that scrambled every message so heavily that, in theory, no one outside the conversation could ever read it. The handsets were expensive, costing around £1,500 for a 6-month contract, and they came with clever tricks built in. The camera, the microphone, and the GPS were removed. Type a certain code into the lock screen and the entire phone would wipe itself instantly. There was even a panic button. The company grew rapidly on the back of relentless online advertising, and across the world, around 60,000 people used the service, with roughly 10,000 of them in the United Kingdom. According to the French authorities, around 90% of those subscribers were criminals, and the British National Crime Agency said it found no evidence of any non-criminal users at all. The phones had one purpose only: organising serious crime, moving substances, laundering money, and planning attacks on rivals. The criminals using these phones felt untouchable. They wrote to each other openly, naming prices, arranging deliveries, sending photographs of cash and product, because they were certain no one could ever see it. In one Manchester case, an offender actually typed out the question, asking whether the police could possibly get into the phones. By the time he sent it, the police were already inside, reading every word. That single message captures the whole story of what happened next. They were wrong. The breakthrough was years in the making. The French National Gendarmerie had first stumbled upon the EncroChat service back in 2017 while investigating organised crime, and traced its servers to France. Cracking it was painstaking work. The investigation accelerated after European funding arrived, and at the end of January 2020, a judge in the French city of Lille authorised something remarkable: the infiltration of the EncroChat servers themselves. Instead of simply shutting the system down, French and Dutch investigators did something far cleverer. They quietly placed a piece of software, a kind of tool, onto the system that let them collect messages before they were scrambled and after they were unscrambled. It could read the criminals' words in plain text, defeat the self-destruct wipe feature, and even record the lock screen PIN codes as users typed them in. It was as if officers were sitting in the room, watching over every shoulder at once. That information was then shared across European law enforcement through Europol and passed to the National Crime Agency in the UK. For weeks, police across Britain simply watched and listened. In total, they were able to monitor the messages in real time for around 74 days. They read millions of messages and saw hundreds of thousands of images. Every deal, every threat, every boast was captured. The NCA built specialist technology just to process the enormous flood of data. And the most difficult and important part of the work began, taking the anonymous handles, the made-up usernames criminals hid behind, and matching each one to a real person in the real world. Then, on the 13th of June 2020, EncroChat realized it had been compromised and sent a frantic message to all its users, telling them to throw their phones away immediately. But the damage was already done. The criminals had handed the police a complete record of their crimes in their own words. The UK side of this enormous effort was given a name: Operation Venetic. The NCA called it the broadest and deepest operation into serious organised crime in British history, and the description was not an exaggeration. The agency's Director of Investigations compared it to having an inside source planted in every top organised crime group in the country at the same time, and a dedicated team of more than 500 NCA officers worked on it day and night, with thousands more across policing involved. The early results alone were staggering. The first wave brought 746 arrests, the seizure of more than £50 million in criminal cash, over 2 tons of substances, and a frightening haul of more than 70 weapons, including handguns, submachine guns, several grenades, and even an AK-47 assault rifle, along with nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition. Investigators also said they had prevented more than 200 planned attacks on people's lives. Over the years that followed, the numbers kept climbing into the thousands of arrests and convictions, with combined prison sentences stretching into the tens of thousands of years. Greater Manchester was one of the busiest fronts in this national operation. The local force's Serious Organised Crime Unit handled the overwhelming majority of the region's prosecutions, and by the summer of 2025, it had made hundreds of arrests connected to the hack, with those sentenced racking up a combined total of well over 2,000 years in prison. The story became so significant that it was eventually turned into a multi-part television documentary about how the breach brought down some of the region's most serious criminals. And one Manchester case stands out as the perfect example of what the police found waiting for them inside those messages. It is the story of a man named Gregory Bell. Bell, born in 1982, ran one of the biggest networks the country had ever seen, and the way he ran it is what makes him so striking. He did not behave like a street dealer, he behaved like a company boss. A senior detective who worked the case described him as operating like a chief executive, and the comparison fits almost perfectly. Bell sat at the top of his organisation and directed everything from a distance, keeping his own hands clean while others did the dangerous work. The scale of his operation was enormous. Through his network, he moved multiple kilos of cocaine, heroin, and other substances every single day, dealing across the entire United Kingdom rather than just one city. The court heard that cocaine moved through the operation at prices between £37,000 and £43,000 a kilo, with cannabis changing hands by the kilo as well. The cold, wholesale arithmetic of a business operating at industrial scale. To hide who he really was, he used a string of strange code names on his EncroChat phone, handles that meant nothing to an outsider but identified him to his contacts. Beneath him sat a structure that genuinely resembled a business. He had couriers to move the product, safe houses to store it, and trusted associates to manage different parts of the operation. The most extraordinary detail is how organised it all was. Bell's couriers actually submitted timesheets, just like ordinary employees, so they could claim payment for the deliveries they had made. His messages showed him approving deals, settling disputes when customers complained about the quality of a batch, and discussing how to wash his profits clean through rental property businesses. This was not chaos. It was a carefully managed enterprise, run with the cold logic of a legitimate company, except the product was destroying lives. When police moved in, what they found confirmed everything the messages had shown. The network used safe houses in the Bury area and in the wealthy village of Alderley Edge to store and package its product. Inside one of those properties, officers found 4 kilos of cocaine, half a kilo of heroin, £35,000 in cash, weapons, and a machine for counting money. Another location held a further £150,000 in cash. And the clearest sign of just how much money Bell had made came from his property holdings. At the time of his arrest in 2020, he owned 32 houses, every single one of which was later frozen by the courts, so the profits of his crimes could be stripped away from him. Bell faced justice at Manchester Crown Court, and in October 2025, he was sentenced to 18 years and 9 months behind bars for directing the supply of substances across the country and for laundering money. He did not fall alone. His associates were sentenced alongside him, including one man who ran his own substance business while also working with Bell, jailed for over 16 years, and another given 10 years for his part in the conspiracy. One of those associates had fled the United Kingdom entirely in 2020 to escape prosecution, only to be tracked down and arrested in Spain in 2024 after an extensive international manhunt, then brought home to face justice. A reminder that for these networks, even fleeing the country was no longer a guaranteed escape. What makes the Bell case so important is what it represents. The old gangs of Manchester fought in the streets, controlled doors, and built their power on fear and reputation. Bell's power was built on logistics, encryption, and the quiet efficiency of a businessman who thought no one would ever read his messages. He was undone not by a frightened witness or a chance arrest, but by his own words, captured forever the moment he typed them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bell may have been the most businesslike of the EncroChat criminals, but he was not the most dangerous. Among the Manchester men exposed by the hack was one who had fled the country entirely, a figure so violent that the National Crime Agency named him among the most dangerous criminals it had ever pursued, and whose crimes went far beyond simply selling product. Section 6. Jaime Rothell and the fugitive who ran a war from the sun. If Gregory Bell showed how calmly a modern crime boss could run his empire like an office job, Jaime Rothell showed the opposite extreme. He proved that the same encrypted phones used to arrange deliveries could also be used to order violence on the streets of England, while the man giving the orders sat thousands of miles away, sunbathing on a foreign coast. His case is one of the most chilling to come out of the entire EncroChat operation, and the National Crime Agency would come to describe him as one of the most dangerous criminals it has ever pursued. Rothell came originally from Salford, the same tough city that produced Paul Massie. By the time the police caught up with him, he was running a drug operation with an estimated street value of around £26 million. The judge who eventually sentenced him said Rothell had dealt more than 200 kilos of cocaine, along with several kilos of other substances, the cocaine alone worth around £7 million. He was not a small player. He sat at the very top of a serious, wealthy network, and he carried himself like a man who believed he was beyond the reach of the law. He was also moving weapons of war. The messages showed him trafficking high-powered firearms, including AK-47 assault rifles, into the United Kingdom. On one occasion, he sent images of AK-47s to an associate with the note that he had a few for sale, and mentioned buying one for himself for over £10,000. Part of why he felt so safe was geography. Rothell was already hiding abroad, wanted in Britain for separate serious matters, and he had set himself up in comfort in Spain and Portugal. From there, he ran his affairs through his EncroChat phone, using the codename Live Long. He believed the distance and the encryption together made him untouchable. He could enjoy the foreign sunshine while his orders travelled instantly back to his associates in England, and no one, he assumed, would ever connect the messages to him. As one Cheshire detective later put it, Rothell lapped up the Spanish sun while his associates searched the streets of Warrington for the people he wanted harmed. Beneath Rothell sat a clear chain of command, and the EncroChat messages laid it bare. Reporting to him were several high-level criminals who each had their own handles, men like Craig Makinson, Callum Morris, James Close, and Zach Rourke, every one of them a serious dealer in his own right, but all answering to Rothell. The detail in those messages was almost surreal in how ordinary it made the criminality seem. One associate was recorded conducting drug deals from the comfort of his hot tub, casually mixing chatter about his personal life with conversations about collecting large piles of cash and whether the firearms had arrived. These were men so convinced of their privacy that they wove serious organized crime into the small talk of their everyday lives. That false confidence is exactly what undid them, because it led them to leave a trail any investigator would dream of. The handles were supposed to protect their identities, but the men ruined that protection themselves. One associate was identified after he sent selfies and photographs of household items that exactly matched what officers later saw when they searched his house, right down to a tattoo that matched his body when he was arrested. Another was identified after sending a simple selfie. A third, confident in his privacy, photographed firearms inside an address that surveillance officers had already watched him entering. They documented their own guilt and attached their own faces to it. What those messages revealed went far beyond the buying and selling of product. Rothell was locked in a bitter feud with a rival crime figure named Leon Cullen, and he used his phone to wage that war by remote control. Cullen was himself a major gang boss who had been on the run as one of Warrington's most wanted men, and who was eventually extradited all the way back from Dubai and jailed for over 22 years. The hatred between the two men ran deep, and Rothwell's messages about him were stark. In one, he described Cullen as his only enemy and made it chillingly clear that when Cullen returned to the UK, that was when the violence would start. In another, sent while Rothell himself was in custody abroad, he wrote of an intention to harm Cullen's associates. From his base abroad, Rothell directed his people in England to hunt down those connected to Cullen's group, with the clear intention of causing them serious harm. In one of the most disturbing details of the case, Rothell effectively put the violence out to tender. He offered large sums of cash to anyone willing to carry out shootings on his behalf, treating an act of brutal violence like a job to be hired out to the lowest bidder. He was meticulous in his planning. When a target was identified, Rothell discussed the man with another EncroChat user, sending the target's home address and images pulled from Google Earth, then talking through the van that would be used in the planned shooting. That same van was later caught on CCTV, pulling up outside an address in Warrington. This was not just talk on a screen. In April 2020, Rothwell's orders turned into real bloodshed. On the evening of the 24th of April, 3 men travelled to Warrington to carry out a targeted shooting on his instructions. One had acquired the firearm, one was the gunman, and one was the driver. The man they shot, on Poplars Avenue, was a 56-year-old, the stepfather of the intended target, hit in the leg, in a case where the violence landed on a man who was not even the person Rothell was hunting. The victim suffered life-changing injuries and was left unable to walk as he once had. A man who had nothing to do with the encrypted phones or the foreign hideaway paid a terrible physical price for a feud being run from another country. The shooting triggered a major investigation by Cheshire Police, working alongside the National Crime Agency, regional crime units, and Greater Manchester Police. As detectives pieced through the EncroChat messages, the trail led straight back to Rothell as the man pulling the strings. The 3 men who had carried out the attack itself were convicted for their parts in it, but it was the figure abroad, the one who never set foot near Warrington that day, who had set the whole thing in motion. And the planning of violence was not a one-off. Throughout the conspiracy, police found message after message detailing planned attacks, including one associate boasting that he would be like an action movie character with a gun hidden in his bin, and another suggesting they target a debtor's family to force payment, with Rothell mentioning he had trackers and cameras that could be used to watch people. When Rothell realized the police were closing in, he ran. He was first arrested abroad in 2020, but when he understood that his encrypted messages had been compromised, he fled again, this time to the Netherlands, trying to stay one step ahead. It did not work. The NCA used its international reach to track him down, and on the 14th of December 2020, he was arrested while riding in a taxi in Amsterdam, caught after Cheshire Police obtained a European arrest warrant. Working with Dutch authorities and prosecutors, British law enforcement brought him home, and he was extradited back to the United Kingdom in March 2021. One investigator made a point of noting that the agency had traced and arrested Rothell not just once but twice, hauling him back from Spain and then from Holland when he tried to flee a second time, and said it should serve as a warning to any fugitive who thinks distance can save them. His case became well known enough to feature in a television documentary about how the EncroChat hack brought down criminals who had ordered violence by text message. The story captured something genuinely new about modern crime. Here was a man who had tried to commit some of the oldest crimes in the book, the settling of a feud through gunfire, but using the newest tools available, encryption and distance, to keep his own hands clean. The hack stripped all of that protection away in an instant. Rothell faced sentencing at Manchester Crown Court in August 2025, and he had already pleaded guilty to a string of serious charges spanning both violence and the supply of substances. The total sentence was enormous, 43 years. That figure was made up of the violence-related conspiracies connected to the Warrington shooting, including the firearms and ammunition charges, and the drug offences in Greater Manchester, with an additional period on extended licence after release. The judge did not hold back in describing the kind of man before him. He told Rothell that he had lived much of his life as a professional criminal involved in serious organised crime, that he had issued orders to others and expected them to be obeyed, and that his own associates had given evidence saying they feared him. The judge noted that Rothell had built his wealth on access to millions of pounds in cash. The senior detective on the case put it bluntly, saying the gang believed they were above the law and that reading their messages had given police real insight into their arrogant, egotistical and uncaring nature. It was a portrait of a man who had grown used to power and to having people do exactly as he commanded, right up until the moment the police could read every command he had ever sent. Rothell was not sentenced alone. He was dealt with alongside a group of 9 associates, and together the whole network received combined sentences adding up to around 207 years. Among them, one of his most senior lieutenants received a sentence of 38 years, almost as long as Rothwell's own. It was one of the largest single results to come out of Greater Manchester's strand of the EncroChat investigation, a complete dismantling of a violent and wealthy operation that had once seemed untouchable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What ties Bell and Rothell together is the false sense of safety the encrypted phones gave them. Both men typed freely, certain no one was watching, and both were undone by their own words. But the EncroChat hall did not only catch men running networks from desks or from foreign apartments, it also exposed criminals whose ambitions stretched across continents, men moving money and product between the United Kingdom and the far corners of the world, and one Manchester figure in particular turned his network into a truly international machine. Section 7. Sadiq and the International Money Web. The criminals caught by the EncroChat hack came in many shapes. Some, like Gregory Bell, ran their networks like calm businessmen. Others, like Jaime Rothell, used the phones to direct violence from abroad. But one Manchester case revealed something else entirely. A man whose operations stretched right across the globe, moving not just product, but vast rivers of cash between continents. His name was Sadiq, and his story shows just how international a single Manchester crime network could become. Sadiq was born in 1984 and lived in the Salford area. To the people around him, he reportedly seemed like a devoted family man, the kind of figure no one would suspect. Behind that ordinary surface, though, sat one of the more significant players in the country's criminal landscape, and the police would later describe him as operating at the very top end of the offenders exposed by the hack. The senior detective who led the case called him an integral player in the organised crime landscape, not just in Greater Manchester, but across the whole country, responsible for supplying potentially lethal weapons, large amounts of ruinous product, and the movement of dirty money on behalf of himself and others. On his EncroChat phone, Sadiq used the handle Mayweather, a clear nod to the famous boxer Floyd Mayweather, with the addition of the letters TMT, the initials of the boxer's own brand, which stands for the Money Team. The choice says something about how he saw himself. He was not a small-time dealer scraping by. He was, in his own mind, the money man, the boss of his own money-making machine. The reality more than matched the boast. Within a window of just 6 weeks, between late March and early May 2020, he was involved in supplying at least 25 kilos of Class A substances, both heroin and cocaine. To put that in perspective, that single 6-week haul was many times larger than the amount the courts treat as the most serious category of offence. The money flowing through his operation was equally enormous. At its peak, the enterprise was capable of generating as much as £250,000 in a single day. What truly set Sadiq apart was the global reach of his contacts. He did not rely on local suppliers. Instead, he reached out across the world, dealing with figures as far away as South America and Dubai to buy product in bulk, which was then broken up and spread across Greater Manchester and the wider United Kingdom. He was a hub, a man sitting at the center of a web whose strands ran to several continents at once. And then there was the money. Moving large amounts of criminal cash is one of the hardest problems a serious network faces, because dirty money is useless until it can be cleaned and spent. A successful operation does not struggle to make money. It struggles to handle the sheer physical bulk of it and to turn suitcases of used banknotes into wealth that can be safely spent. Sadiq had built a sophisticated system to solve exactly that problem. He used a method based on tokens, a way of moving hundreds of thousands of pounds across borders without physically carrying cash through airports. The principle is simple and old. Rather than transporting the actual notes, value is passed through trusted brokers who settle accounts between themselves, so the money effectively teleports from one country to another, while the physical cash never crosses a single border. Through this system, money was funneled to places including Barcelona, Amsterdam, Pakistan, and Dubai. He laundered at least £1.5 million in criminal cash over the period the police examined, helping dirty money reach Europe and the Middle East. The scale of his ambition in this area is genuinely startling. In one EncroChat message, Sadiq told another user that he wanted that person to launder £250,000 for him every single day, and then asked whether they could push that figure up to £500,000 a day. He was not only handling his own money, he acted as a kind of financial fixer for other criminals too, helping them move their cash internationally, including arranging the movement of £250,000 from Glasgow to Amsterdam on behalf of another EncroChat user. He was, in effect, running a private international bank for the underworld, a service other criminals came to when they needed their profits to disappear and reappear somewhere far away. Sadiq's network was not only about substances and money either. The messages also showed him involved in the buying and selling of weapons and ammunition, with deals connected to places including London, Birmingham, and York. He dealt predominantly in a particular type of handgun known as a Grand Power 9, along with rounds of ammunition, including an agreement to supply as many as 100 rounds to one contact. He was, in the words of one senior detective, responsible for the supply of potentially lethal weapons, large amounts of damaging product, and the movement of dirty money on behalf of himself and others. Crucially, Sadiq tried to keep himself at a safe distance from the physical handling of any of it. Like the cleverest of these operators, he understood that the way to avoid getting caught was to never touch the product yourself. The lead detective described exactly this, explaining that Sadiq would refrain from any hands-on role specifically to avoid being caught, and would instead look to naive and trusted couriers to take the physical risks for him. He gave the orders and let others carry the danger. In theory, that made him almost impossible to pin down. In practice, his own messages on a phone he believed was completely secure became the very evidence that brought him down. One of the people who took those physical risks for him was a courier named Junaid Ahmed, who was caught up in the same investigation. Ahmed used a car, a black Skoda, that had been specially adapted with a hidden compartment, a secret space built into the vehicle and disguised to look like an ordinary part of the boot, designed to look like nothing more than the back of the rear seats when viewed from inside the boot. When police recovered the car on a street in the Crumpsall area, they searched it and found that hidden space, along with half a kilo of a brown powder later confirmed to be heroin. The way police linked Ahmed to the network is a neat example of how these cases were built. He was spotted by automatic number plate cameras on major motorways, including the M1 and the M62, captured on CCTV passing through a motorway toll booth in his black Skoda as he returned towards his home in the Cheetum Hill area, and placed through detailed phone work close to the exact postcodes Sadiq had named in his encrypted messages. Piece by piece, the digital trail tied the courier to the boss. The police moved on both men in the summer of 2020. Sadiq was arrested in June, and when officers searched him, they recovered 3 mobile devices among other important items. True to the code of his world, he answered no comment to every single question put to him in interview. But his silence in the interview room counted for little against the mountain of his own words already captured from the encrypted network. Sadiq faced sentencing at Manchester Crown Court, and in November 2022, he was jailed for over 18 years. He had pleaded guilty to a range of serious charges covering the supply of Class A substances, money laundering, and conspiracies connected to selling firearms and ammunition. His courier, Ahmed, was sentenced at the same hearing for his part in the conspiracy. The lead detective summed up the significance of the result, calling it a fantastic outcome after months of meticulous work, and noting that the EncroChat takedown had given the police a chance to remove hundreds of organized criminals from society, with Sadiq sitting firmly at the high end of that group. The Sadiq case captures something important about how Manchester's criminal world had changed. The gangs of the Gunchester era fought over street corners and city centre clubs, their world measured in a few square miles of the city. Sadiq's world had no such borders. His suppliers were on other continents, his money flowed to Spain, Holland, Pakistan and the Gulf, and his weapons deals reached across England. A single man in Salford had built a machine that touched the entire planet, all coordinated from a phone in his pocket. For all their differences, the EncroChat criminals shared one fatal flaw. They were caught because they wrote everything down, trusting a system that betrayed them. But not every Manchester network was brought down that way, and not every boss ended up behind bars. In one of the most striking recent cases, the police dismantled an entire organised group, seized kilos of product and stacks of cash, and jailed 6 men, while the suspected mastermind slipped through their fingers and remains a wanted man to this day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For all their differences, the EncroChat criminals shared one fatal flaw. They were caught because they wrote everything down, trusting a system that betrayed them. But not every Manchester network was brought down that way, and not every boss ended up behind bars. In one of the most striking recent cases, the police dismantled an entire organised group, seized kilos of product and stacks of cash, and jailed 6 men, while the suspected mastermind slipped through their fingers and remains a wanted man to this day. Section 8. Thomas Hunt and the boss who got away. Every story so far has ended the same way. The police catch their man, the courtroom doors close, and the sentence is read out. But the criminal world does not always tidy itself up so neatly. Sometimes the foot soldiers fall, and the general escapes. The case of Thomas Hunt is exactly that kind of story, a recent and unfinished one, where an entire organised crime group was taken apart piece by piece, yet the man believed to have built it remains free to this day. Hunt, born in 1977 and from the Middleton area of Greater Manchester, is described by police as the head and the suspected mastermind of a serious drug operation. His group was not some small street outfit. It ran on a commercial scale, moving cocaine, heroin, mumma, and amphetamine worth more than £1.5 million, and it did so across the whole country, rather than just the local area. The gang used encrypted apps and mobile phones to talk to each other, hired self-storage units to hide their stock, and relied on couriers to carry product up and down the United Kingdom. Their main period of activity ran from March to October 2024, which makes this one of the freshest cases in this entire story. What makes Hunt such an interesting figure is the way he ran things. Like several of the cleverest bosses, he understood that the secret to staying free was to keep his own hands as clean as possible. According to the police, Hunt deliberately removed himself from the day-to-day work of the gang. He directed the operation from his home and from other properties, choosing where product would be stored and controlling the movement of goods and money. But he tried not to be physically present when the risky handovers happened. He let other people take those chances while he stayed in the shadows. It almost worked, but surveillance is patient and the police were watching. Detectives deployed covert tactics, careful observation, and detailed phone work to map the gang from the outside, building their picture slowly and quietly over months. Even though Hunt tried to stay removed, those covert tactics caught him out, because officers saw senior members of the gang reporting back to him after deliveries had been made and after visits to the storage units. The structure itself gave him away. A man at the center of a web is betrayed by the strands that all lead back to him. He was also regularly seen visiting a particular address in the Moss Bank area, and when police eventually searched that address, they found 11 kilos of cocaine along with the heavy equipment used to press product into blocks. That single location told them just how serious the operation really was. The man directly beneath Hunt was Dylan Robinson, also from Middleton, who acted as the right-hand man and the logistics controller. Robinson was the one who kept the machine running. He managed 2 self-storage containers where product and ammunition were kept, organized supply to other crime groups, and directed couriers across the country. He was a constant presence, making handovers, visiting Hunt's home again and again, and coordinating trips to cities including Bristol, Carlisle, and Newcastle. When he was finally arrested at his home, officers found him with more than £61,000 in cash, along with cocaine, heroin, and the keys to both storage units. Robinson was jailed for 12 years and 6 months. His charges including not only the supply of Class A substances, but also possessing ammunition without the required firearm certificate, a detail that shows the operation was never far from weapons. The operation was very much a family and associates affair, and the spread of roles within it reveals how a modern drug network actually divides up its labor. Hunt's own brother, Anthony Hunt, handled stock and equipment for the gang and was arrested inside one of the group's safe houses, where his DNA was found on gloves used in the trade. He was jailed for 11 years and 3 months. A man named Stanley Ainsley acted as a courier and storeman, making multiple trips under the direction of those above him, and storing product at his own home. And when police arrested him, they found over 6 kilos of amphetamine along with other product and cash. Another member, Graham Sykes, was jailed for over 5 years for his role in supply and for the production of cannabis. A man named Thomas Lockwood served as the group's tester, a specialized job whose entire purpose was to check the quality and purity of the cocaine and heroin before it was sold on, ensuring the customers got what they paid for. The partner of Hunt's daughter, Robert Earnshaw, ran a local dealership in Rochdale, supplied by the main group, and was caught with cannabis and a burner phone full of messages evidencing Class A supply. His relationship to the family gave him access to the gang's inner circle. The network even reached far to the south of England, with a courier named Aidan Hopkins, based down in Hampshire, making 9 separate trips north to collect product for a southern gang that bought from the Manchester operation, before being arrested with Class A substances hidden in his vehicle and a viable firearm at his home. The roles did not stop at the men. Several women connected to the gang through their partners were also drawn into the conspiracy and dealt with by the court, mostly receiving suspended sentences, meaning they avoided immediate prison but would face custody if they offended again. One, the partner of Anthony Hunt, had assisted by driving him to exchanges and providing access to addresses, and was detained after attending the Moss Bank house with him. Another had a striking link to an earlier chapter of this story. She had become involved through her partner, a man who had already been jailed for 36 years for his part in a completely separate organized crime gang, and who had continued running a drug business even from behind bars. Her DNA was found on a glove bearing traces of cocaine. The threads connecting these networks to one another run deep. When the police finally moved in and executed their warrants, the scale of what they recovered confirmed everything the surveillance had suggested. Across the operation, officers seized over 15 kilos of cocaine, nearly 2 kilos of heroin, more than 6 kilos of amphetamine, almost 7,000 ecstasy tablets, more than £75,000 in cash, and over 200 rounds of live ammunition. This was a complete drug operation, with product, money, and weapons all flowing through the same hands. In December 2025, the case reached court, and the result was significant. Several members of the group were given custodial sentences, with 6 of them jailed for a combined total of 44 years and 8 months. The senior detective on the case made the point plainly, describing the operation not as a street-level affair, but as something highly structured, with product dealt and shipped across the country on an industrial scale. the work of people motivated purely by greed and with no regard for the devastation that Class A substances cause in communities. But for all the sentences handed down, the case has an ending that refuses to close. Thomas Hunt, the man at the very top, was not in the dock. He remains at large, wanted by Greater Manchester Police, who have made it clear that catching him is still a live priority. A senior detective put it plainly, saying their attention firmly remains on capturing Hunt and bringing him to justice, and that all the powers available to them are being used to find him. The message from the police was the familiar one, that if you engage in organized crime, they will find you and put you in prison. But Hunt himself is the awkward exception to that promise, a free man while his network sits in cells. Hunt is not alone in that. The hunt for fugitive bosses has become a distinct strand of modern policing in Greater Manchester, so much so that the force runs a dedicated unit whose entire job is to track down its most wanted criminals. The pattern those officers chase is a familiar one. Time and again, the figures at the very top of these networks respond to the threat of arrest by fleeing the country entirely, slipping abroad to places like Spain and Dubai, while still maintaining their links back to Manchester. Some are eventually caught and extradited, as we have already seen. Others, for now, remain ghosts. Hunt is one of those ghosts. His case is a useful reminder that the war against these networks is never truly finished. The police dismantled the structure, seized the product, froze the money, and jailed the workers, yet the person they most wanted slipped through the net. It shows both the strength of modern investigation, capable of taking apart an entire operation through patient surveillance, and its limits, because a determined boss who keeps his distance and stays mobile can still avoid the final reckoning, at least for a time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Hunt case also points to a feature of the modern trade that keeps appearing: the encrypted apps, the burner phones, the careful structure designed to keep the leader untouchable. These networks treat their communications as the crown jewels, the one thing that must never fall into the wrong hands. And that obsession with secret messaging is exactly what defines the next case, where an entire Manchester gang chatted away on what they believed were unbreakable phones, naming prices and counting profits of millions a month, never imagining that every word was being read. Section 9. The £2 million a month gang. Throughout this story, one phrase keeps returning like a drumbeat. They thought they were untouchable. The criminals caught by the EncroChat hack shared a single, fatal belief. They were convinced that their phones could not be read, and so they wrote down everything, every price, every weight, every boast about how much money was coming in. The case in this section is perhaps the purest example of that mistake, because it centered on a gang whose own messages revealed they were pulling in more than £2 million every single month, and who left that figure sitting in black and white for the police to find. This was a Manchester-based organised crime group, and the heart of their business was simple to describe but enormous in scale: the importation and supply of multiple kilos of Class A substances, identified as cocaine and heroin, combined with the laundering of the vast amounts of cash that trade produced. They were not street dealers selling small amounts on a corner. They operated at the wholesale level, buying and moving product in bulk, and the money flowing through their hands was staggering. Over £2 million a month is the kind of turnover that would make many legitimate businesses envious, except every penny of it came from substances that cause real harm in real communities. It is worth pausing on what that figure actually means, because numbers this large can wash over a person without landing. £2 million a month is roughly £65,000 a day, every day, weekends included. It is more than most people in the country will earn across their entire working lives, arriving and being counted and moved on within a single month, again and again. And this was not a sprawling international syndicate of hundreds of people. It was a tight group of men operating out of ordinary towns on the northern edge of Greater Manchester, in places like Middleton, Chadderton, and Rochdale. The gap between the modest streets they lived on and the sums passing through their hands is one of the most striking things about the whole case. The way the police built the case against them is by now a familiar pattern, but it never stops being remarkable. The evidence was initially gathered from the encrypted phone conversations between the members of the gang. Every member was identified by their EncroChat handle, the odd nicknames they used to talk to each other, in the belief that those names protected their real identities. The detective's job was to take those handles, study the messages attached to each one, and then prove which real person sat behind each name. Once they cracked that puzzle, the messages became a complete confession, written by the criminals themselves. That work of attribution, of proving who sat behind each handle, is the quiet heart of every EncroChat prosecution, and it is far harder than it sounds. A handle on its own proves nothing. In court, the prosecution cannot simply assert that a man was the user called by a particular nickname. It has to be demonstrated with evidence, because the entire defense in many of these cases rests on challenging exactly that link. So detectives become detectives of detail. They cross-reference the locations a handle mentions against where a suspect was known to be. They match photographs sent on the encrypted phone against a suspect's home, his belongings, even his tattoos. They line up the timing of messages against surveillance sightings and number plate camera hits. The messages themselves are often a code that has to be carefully unpicked, full of slang, abbreviations, and what are sometimes called tick lists, the running tallies of who owes what. Every link in that chain has to hold, because every link is something a defense barrister will try to break. The fact that these 4 men were convicted tells you the chain held. 4 men sat at the center of this case, and the messages laid bare exactly what each of them did. The first was a man named Lobley, who used the handle Keratoxic. He was a serious mover of product. The evidence showed he had taken possession of at least 19 kilos of cocaine, which carried a street value of somewhere between roughly £680,000 and nearly £800,000, and that he had supplied it on to others. That alone would have made him a significant offender. But the police found something more troubling in his messages. While reading his conversations with another encrypted handle, they discovered that Lobley had a firearm, which he arranged to pass on to a third party. This is one of the most important things about cases like these. The hack did not only catch people selling product, it also caught weapons changing hands, removing guns from the streets before they could be used. Lobley initially denied the firearm offense and pleaded not guilty, but he was later found guilty following a trial. The second man was Thomas Bradley, from the Middleton area, who used the handle Lovely Seal, and his role tells you a great deal about how these operations actually function. Bradley was the money man. He was recognized as someone who was collecting cash from 20 other encrypted handles, and his encrypted device, when the police finally tied it to him, was found to be linked to all the key figures in the conspiracy and to every single one of the identified money laundering events. He was, in a very real sense, the spine that held the whole operation together. Think about what his role actually involved, because it reveals something most people never consider about the drug trade. A successful drug operation does not have a money problem in the sense of being short of it. It has the opposite problem. It generates so much physical cash in used, untraceable banknotes that simply gathering it all, counting it and moving it, becomes a full-time job in itself, and a genuinely difficult one. In other EncroChat cases across the country, investigators have pulled back the curtain on exactly what this work looks like. In one, a woman who acted as a banker for a crime group had acquired a safe and a vacuum packing machine, with bags specifically large enough to hold £50,000 bundles of cash, and a single collection from her was recorded at over £100,000. That is the texture of the job. It is warehouses of money that has to be hidden, compressed, sealed, and shifted without ever touching a bank. Bradley was the hub that 20 different sources of this dirty money flowed into, a human collection point for the profits of the entire network. The third man was Craig Ganson, from the Chadderton area, who went by the handle Paperbore, and he was the wholesale regional supplier of both cocaine and heroin. He was the one feeding product into the regional market. Over a period of just over 2 months, between early April and early June 2020, he purchased at least 11 kilos of cocaine and 2 kilos of heroin from his own suppliers, a haul valued at over £400,000. He sat in the middle of the chain, buying in bulk from those above him and passing product down to those below. The fourth man was Paul Taylor, from the Rochdale area, who used the handle Orgu, and his messages give us one of those small, precise details that makes the scale of the operation suddenly real. On a single day, the 21st of April 2020, Taylor purchased 1 kilo of cocaine for £37,000. That one figure tells you the going rate, the cold arithmetic of the trade. And over the course of the conspiracy, Taylor passed more than £80,000 to Bradley, the money collector, feeding the river of cash that ran through the whole network. When you put these four roles side by side, the structure of a modern drug operation comes into clear focus. There was a man bringing in and supplying the product at wholesale level. There was a man taking possession of large quantities and pushing them onward, who also dabbled in weapons. There was a man whose entire job was gathering the cash from 20 different sources. And there was a man buying specific amounts and feeding money back up the chain. It was a machine with specialized parts, each person handling one piece of the operation, all of it coordinated through phones they believed no one could ever read. This is the thing worth understanding about modern organized crime. It is not a chaotic scramble of dealers and thugs. It is a supply chain, a logistics business, with roles as clearly defined as any legitimate company. Purchasing, distribution, finance, security. The only difference is the product and the willingness to use violence to protect it. That belief in their own privacy was their undoing. Once the EncroChat system was infiltrated, every one of those conversations became evidence. The handles that were supposed to hide them, instead, became the threads the police pulled to unravel the whole thing. There was no need for an informant to risk their life giving evidence. No need for a frightened witness to point a finger in court. The criminals had documented their own crimes in detail, and that documentation put them away. The reaction of the gang once they realized the danger tells its own story, and it mirrors so many of the other cases in this series. After Greater Manchester Police carried out a strike day against the network in March 2022, Bradley, the money man, did exactly what bosses across this story have done. He ran. He fled the country. But like so many others, he found that fleeing was no longer the escape it once might have been. He was arrested returning to the United Kingdom through the port of Holyhead, the ferry gateway between Wales and Ireland, in December 2022. His attempt to disappear ending at a passport check. The instinct to flee, and the failure of that instinct against modern, connected policing, has become one of the defining patterns of the EncroChat era. In June 2024, the case concluded with the four men jailed for a combined total of 36 years and 6 months. The sentences reflected each man's role in the machine. Lobley, the product mover caught with the firearm, received the most serious share. Bradley, the money man, was jailed for 9 years. Ganson, the wholesale supplier, received just under 8 years. And Taylor, the man feeding cash up the chain, was given over 5.5 years. A detective on the case made the point that the operation had not only taken 4 drug dealers off the streets of Manchester, but had also disrupted a supplier of firearms, a reminder that these investigations protect communities on more than one front. The officer's words were straightforward, that the result had taken these men off the streets for a considerable period, and that it followed a genuinely complex investigation involving the work of many people. This case sits within a much larger pattern, because the gang was far from unique. Across Greater Manchester and the wider Northwest, the same story played out again and again as detectives worked through the EncroChat data. Tight crews of wholesale suppliers and the bankers who washed their money, identified through their handles, tracked through their own photographs and messages, and jailed for decades at a time. Specialist teams in towns across the region each received their own packs of thousands of anonymous messages and set about the painstaking work of putting real faces to the made-up names. The £2 million a month gang was simply one especially clear example of a process that quietly dismantled dozens of these networks, one handle at a time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This case, and all the EncroChat cases before it, share a common shape. They are about powerful, wealthy criminal operations, brought down not by violence or chance, but by their own written words. Yet for all the millions of pounds and all the kilos of product, there is a cost to the drug trade that never appears on a balance sheet or in a list of seizures. It is paid by the most vulnerable people of all, And it brings us to the final and perhaps most disturbing case in this story, one that moves away from the bosses and the money and asks a harder question. Who actually does the dangerous work at the bottom of these networks? And what happens to them? Section 10. The children at the bottom of the chain. Every story in this video has been about people at the top. The bosses, the suppliers, the money men, the fixers who built empires and counted their profits in the millions. But a drug network is shaped like a pyramid, and the people at the top never touch the streets. Someone else does the most dangerous work, standing on corners, holding the product, carrying the cash, taking the risk of arrest and violence. And in the most disturbing cases of all, the people doing that work are not adults at all. They are children, pulled in by older criminals who treat them as cheap, disposable labor. This final case is about exactly that, and it is the one that lingers longest after the others fade. The man at the center of it was Aaron Kenny, born in May 2000 and living on Ashton Old Road in Manchester. He was still in his early 20s when his crimes caught up with him, which makes what he did all the more striking. Kenny was not a faded old gangster from the Gunchester years. He was a young man operating in the present day, running a modern drug line built on the exploitation of those even younger than himself. His operation was uncovered through a police investigation called Operation Charger, which ran from 2019 until 2021 and focused on the supply of Class A and Class B substances in the Tameside area on the eastern edge of Greater Manchester. At the heart of that investigation was a drug line that Kenny ran, known as Sam N. Marco, or SNM for short. A drug line, in this world, is essentially a phone number that customers call to place orders, the engine of a local dealing operation. Kenny was the one in charge of it, identified by police as the mastermind behind it. He coordinated the supply of product, oversaw the growing of cannabis, and organized the movement of substances from place to place. On paper, he was a fairly typical local dealer running a fairly typical local line. What lifts his case out of the ordinary and into something genuinely dark is how he got the work done. Kenny did not take the risks himself. Instead, he used children to do his dealing for him. He had them hold the product so that if anyone was caught with it, it would not be him. He had them manage the drug line mobile phone, the very heart of the operation, the single most important object in any dealing line because it is the link to every customer. And he had them collect the money from deals. The children were used for every dangerous hands-on task, while Kenny stayed at a safe distance, just like the bosses in every other case in this story. The difference is that his workers were not grown men who had chosen a criminal life. They were kids, used, in the words of reporting on the case, as pawns in his criminal network, and he did not persuade them gently. The court heard that Kenny used threats of violence to get children to do his dealing. This is the cruel mechanism at the center of so much child exploitation in the drug trade. A child is drawn in, perhaps with the promise of easy money or a sense of belonging, and then, once they are involved, fear takes over. Threats keep them in place. They become too frightened to walk away and too frightened to tell anyone. Kenny relied on that fear to keep his operation running. To understand why this matters so much, it helps to understand that Kenny's case was not an isolated act of individual cruelty, but an example of one of the fastest growing forms of crime in modern Britain. It has a name now, recognized by police forces, courts, and government: child criminal exploitation. The official way of describing it captures the heart of the problem precisely. It is what happens when an individual or group takes advantage of an imbalance of power to coerce, control, manipulate, or deceive a child into criminal activity. The phrase that matters there is imbalance of power. A grown man and a 14-year-old are not equals. When the man has money, status, a reputation for violence, and the boy has none of those things, talk of the child choosing to be involved becomes meaningless. The scale of this is genuinely alarming. The Children's Commissioner has estimated that at least 27,000 children across the country are at high risk of this kind of exploitation. 27,000. Kenny's victims were a tiny handful among a national epidemic. The grooming process that draws these children in is well understood by the professionals who fight it, even if it remains hidden from most of the public. It rarely begins with threats. It begins with friendship, with attention, with gifts and money, and a feeling of being valued, often aimed at children who are already vulnerable, perhaps struggling at home, excluded from school, or hungry for status and belonging. Only once the child is enmeshed, once they feel they owe something or have something to hide, does the warmth curdle into control. A debt is suddenly claimed, a favor is suddenly demanded, and then the threats begin. By that point, the child is trapped, often too ashamed or too frightened to turn to the very adults who could help them. Kenny's reliance on the fear of violence was simply the final stage of a machine that grinds children down into disposable workers. That machine has a vocabulary all of its own, a set of techniques so common that the authorities have given each of them a name, and understanding those names is the clearest way to see how deliberate and how organized this exploitation really is. One of the most important is debt bondage, sometimes called entrapment. The principle is simple and cruel. A child is given product to sell, and then, conveniently, that product is lost or stolen. Sometimes in a robbery the gang itself arranges. Suddenly the child owes the gang money, often hundreds or thousands of pounds, and the only way to work off the debt is to keep dealing on the gang's terms. The debt never really shrinks. It is a leash dressed up as an obligation, and it keeps a frightened child working long after they would have run. Another technique is the one professionals call going missing, and it is one of the clearest warning signs that a child has been pulled into a line. Children are sent away from home, sometimes for days at a time, to deal in places where they are not known. Their absence from school, from their bedrooms, from their families becomes a pattern, and that pattern is often the first thing a teacher or a parent or a social worker notices before anyone understands what is really happening. The child who keeps disappearing is rarely just being difficult. They are frequently being moved like stock. There is also the practice the authorities refer to as cuckooing, named after the bird that takes over another's nest. Here the gang takes over the home of a vulnerable adult, often someone with an addiction, a disability, or a mental health problem, and uses that person's flat or house as a base to store product, count money, and run the line. The rightful occupant is pushed aside in their own home, sometimes having their benefits taken, sometimes left to go hungry, while strangers come and go at all hours. Police describe one verified example of a man who had been a professional, who lost a family member to suicide, whose life then spiraled into a drug dependence and a drug debt, and who ended up with an organized crime group running their operation out of his address, taking his money and leaving him so neglected that he lost a dangerous amount of weight in a very short time. For the children sent to deal, a cuckooed flat is often where they are made to stay, which is exactly what we will see in a moment. And there is a method so disturbing it is hard to discuss, which the authorities call by various clinical names, but which amounts to forcing a child to hide drugs inside their own body, to move them past any search. That this is done to children at all is perhaps the single starkest illustration of how completely these gangs treat young people as objects rather than people. There is a strange and revealing detail in how Kenny himself was eventually caught. He was originally arrested in 2021, but he briefly disappeared before police apprehended him again in December of that same year. When they finally caught up with him, he was found hiding in a flat in the city centre, and at that point he had 2 broken legs. His injuries were so serious that he needed a driver to take him to drug deals because he could not get around on his own. The authorities never explained how he came to have 2 broken legs, but the image is a telling one. Here was a young man so committed to his trade that even with both legs broken, unable to walk, he was still being driven from deal to deal, still running his line. It is a small glimpse into how completely the drug world can consume a person, and a faint, grim echo of the fates that so often await those who climb into this life, whether at the top or the bottom. In November 2024, Kenny faced sentencing at Minshall Street Crown Court in Manchester. He was found guilty of supplying cocaine, heroin, and cannabis, and he was jailed for 11 years. The police officer who spoke after the case, a sergeant from Greater Manchester Police's Child Criminal Exploitation Team in Tameside, did not hide his feelings. He said that using violence or the fear of violence to make vulnerable people in the community sell substances was bad enough, but that to use a child for it was simply unforgivable. He expressed the hope that the result would allow the young victims to put the experience behind them and to live, finally, as the children they actually were. That last phrase is worth holding on to, because it names exactly what is stolen in these cases. Not just safety, not just innocence, but childhood itself. The simple right to be a child rather than a criminal's tool. Kenny's case was not a one-off freak event. It sits within a wider and well-documented pattern that police call county lines, where city-based gangs extend their drug dealing out into smaller towns, often using children to carry product along the routes between them. The model is grimly efficient. A line, that single dedicated phone number, is run from a city like Manchester, and children are sent out to towns where the gang has no roots and no faces known to the local police, to do the dealing in their place. The Tameside area produced an even starker example of this than Kenny's case, one that shows the full horror of the county lines model. In a separate investigation, an organised group led by a man named Jaime Upton, working alongside his second-in-command and a female courier who moved the children around, was jailed for exploiting 3 boys. The trio of boys were given mobile phones and transported again and again along the M62 motorway between Tameside and the city of Hull, often going missing from their homes for days at a time. When they got there, they were made to stay overnight in properties so filthy and so saturated with drugs that they were described in court as crack dens, places frequently visited by people addicted to substances. The detail that captures the contempt at the heart of it is this: the boss himself refused to stay in those squalid properties, choosing a nearby hotel instead, while the children he was exploiting were left in the filth. To keep the boys obedient, the gang used threats of violence, and in one chilling instance, a gang member threatened to harm, to chop, the sister of one of the boys if he did not keep following their orders. The threat was not even aimed at the child himself, but at his family, a way of making escape feel impossible. The way that case came to light shows both the tragedy and the hope in equal measure. In June 2020, the police were alerted to concerns about one of the boys, who had gone missing from home. The search for him led across the country to a flat in Hull, where officers found the missing boy asleep on a sofa, surrounded by 5 mobile phones and a small amount of money, the tools and meagre takings of the trade he had been forced into. From that single missing child, detectives from Tameside's child criminal exploitation team pulled the thread, and the text messages they uncovered told the whole chilling story of cross-country exploitation. The leaders were eventually convicted not just of drug offences, but of arranging or facilitating the movement of a person for exploitation, a modern slavery offence. That framing matters enormously. The law recognised those boys not as junior criminals, but as victims of slavery, which is what they were. The shift to treating these children as victims rather than offenders did not happen by accident, and it is worth understanding how it came about, because it represents one of the few genuinely hopeful threads in this whole grim story. For a long time, the standard police approach to a drug network was to work from the top down, targeting the importers and the people moving the largest quantities. The young people at the very end of the chain, the ones actually caught holding product or dealing on a corner, were often simply treated as low-level criminals and prosecuted as such. Greater Manchester's specialist teams did something that was described as genuinely groundbreaking. They turned the usual method on its head. Instead of starting at the top of a drug line's phone traffic, they looked right at the bottom of it, at the people doing the actual dealing, and then cross-referenced those individuals against children already known to social services. What they found was sobering. Many of those young dealers were themselves victims, sometimes children who had previously been known as victims of sexual exploitation, and sometimes very young people who had never been on anyone's radar at all. Seeing the dealers at the end of the line as victims to be safeguarded, rather than offenders to be charged, changed everything about how these cases were approached. That change was built into the structure of policing in the region. Greater Manchester runs a long-standing partnership response to serious and organised crime, launched in 2014, which over the years grew to include a dedicated county lines team covering the whole of the region, a specialist modern slavery unit established the following year, and complex safeguarding hubs working alongside child exploitation task forces. These teams do the hard end of the work, executing warrants, pursuing the high-harm offenders, seizing product and weapons. But they are also charged with protecting the vulnerable people caught up in it, and making sure those people get a safeguarding response rather than just a criminal record. The region also built public campaigns specifically around criminal exploitation, branding the issue with a name designed to make people understand it, recognizing that county lines is not really about drugs at the level of the child involved, it is about a young person being trapped. A crucial and frustrating part of the picture, which the authorities themselves have raised, is that even now there is no single statutory definition in law of child criminal exploitation or of cuckooing. That might sound like a technicality, but it has real consequences. Without a clear legal definition, victims can find it harder to access support and harder to be properly recognized and safeguarded, and professionals across different agencies can end up working from slightly different understandings of the same problem. Those on the front line in Greater Manchester have argued that a shared statutory definition would allow for a more consistent and more protective response across the whole country. It is a reminder that the law is still, in some respects, catching up with a form of exploitation that the criminals understood and industrialized long before the system had a name for it. There is a way out, too, because the same agencies that prosecute these cases also work to rescue the children caught in them, and there are routes to help that exist, whether or not a young person ever feels able to speak to the police. Home Office-funded specialist services exist specifically to support and rescue young people drawn into county lines, including one charity that runs a dedicated rescue service for young people up to the age of 25, and their families across several regions, including Greater Manchester, and a national confidential support line run by a missing people charity that offers a safe space for anyone affected by this kind of exploitation to talk through what is happening to them. The officers involved in these cases are careful to send a direct message to any young person trapped in this world that help exists, that there are youth workers and charities and confidential ways to reach out, and that being caught up in this is not their fault. A child who has been forced into this is seen, increasingly, as someone to be protected, not punished. Two of the Tameside cases became among the force's first convictions secured specifically as modern slavery, which represents a real shift in how the system understands these children, not as offenders to be locked up, but as victims to be saved. This is the cost of the drug trade that never appears in the headline figures. When the news reports a gang jailed for a combined 200 years, or a network turning over £2 million a month, those numbers are real, but they are also abstract. They do not show you the 11-year-old holding a bag of product on a cold corner because a man twice his age threatened to hurt his family. They do not show you the boy moved between crack dens in a town 100 miles from home, missing from his own bed for days, asleep on a stranger's sofa, surrounded by the phones that ran his exploitation. They do not show you the vulnerable man whose home was stolen out from under him, or the child made to carry a debt that was designed never to be paid off. The empires built by the bosses in this story rest, at their very base, on the exploitation of the most vulnerable people imaginable. That is the thread that connects every case in this video, from the street wars of Moss Side to the encrypted phones of the modern era. Beneath the nicknames, the rivalries, the money and the weapons, the drug trade has always run on the same fuel: people willing to use other people. The Gooch used young men with no work and no money. The Nunans used fear to control an entire city's nightlife. The EncroChat bosses used couriers and bankers and runners as expendable parts in a machine. And at the very bottom, men like Kenny and Upton used actual children, threatening their families, dumping them in crack dens, treating their childhoods as raw material to be burned for profit. The names and the methods changed across the decades, but that core never did. And it raises the question this whole story has been building toward, the one worth sitting with as we draw everything together. Across more than 30 years of Manchester's most notorious networks, what actually changed? What stayed exactly the same? And what does the long arc of this city's underworld really teach us? If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.